Welcome to What a Creep, the show with Margot Donahue and Sonia Mansfield talking about creeps from the past to the present.
This is your quick guide to the biggest creeps, jerks, and losers, the best of the worst.
Past episodes include Mark Wahlberg, Russell Simmons, Moms for Liberty, Firefest, also reality TV, creepy stand-up comedians, and historical events that will send a chill up your spine.
Get out all your rage as we call out all the sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all the other bad stuff in the world.
And then we end each episode with someone who is not a creep, so you don't end up feeling that the world is a total dumpster fire.
We're just two nice ladies who want the world to be a little less creepy.
Be sure to subscribe to the What a Creep podcast on your favorite podcast app and follow us on social media.
But don't follow us too closely, you creep.
Our Weird World.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and as I record this, I have just eaten lunch, which we've talked about this before. Podcasting is a lot like going and swimming. You need to wait at least 30 minutes after you eat, and I still don't follow that rule. No one does. So be interested to see how this goes, because this will be a fun episode in more than one way. So today, talking about some certifiably crazy people. They are serial killers, but these three had one thing in common, and that is that the voices in their head told them to kill, and boy did they. And so trigger warning for the last story today of Richard Chase. It's pretty gruesome and pretty wild. Really, honestly, it's more wild than it is gruesome, but figured I'd throw that warning in there anyway. But before we get to his story, we are also going to cover the stories of Herbert Mullin and our first story of Charles Ray Hatcher. Charles Ray Hatcher was born on July 16th, 1929 in Mound City, Missouri. As most serial killers tend to go, or the stories tend to go, his father was an abusive alcoholic, and Hatcher was also bullied a lot in school, which two good ingredients to make a mentally unstable serial killer. In 1935, when he was 6 years old, Hatcher was out flying a kite that he and his brothers had fashioned out of copper wire that they had found in an old Ford Model T. And then just as Hatcher's brother, Arthur Allen, was about to hand over the kite to give Hatcher a turn, the kite struck a power line and electrocuted his brother to death. That, obviously super, super traumatic, which was the excuse that Hatcher's father needed to leave the family and go be an alcoholic somewhere else. Also, really mentally screwed with, Hatcher himself, Charles Hatcher himself, because, he was seconds away from getting electrocuted, right? Like he was the next one to play with the kite. And also, here's the thing, kids. That's why kites use like nylon string now and not copper wire, because copper wire conducts electricity, and you get near power lines with that, you're going to have a bad time. So over the next 30 years, Hatcher was in and out of prison for things like theft and forgery and burglary. There was an attempted kidnapping charge. And despite being sentenced under the Habitual Criminal Act after attempting to abduct a 16-year-old boy, Hatcher was then somehow released from prison for a seventh time in 1963, which is insane to me. And like, good on Missouri for having a habitual criminal act. I don't know what it does. Clearly doesn't keep people locked up forever, because he was in prison for 7 different times and was released all 7 times. So by 1963, after finally kind of realizing that he wasn't exactly a very popular person in Missouri, and also that he could clearly do whatever he wanted and eventually get away with it, he moved off to California. Shocking, right? Always California. On August 27th, 1969, Hatcher kidnapped and strangled 12-year-old William Freeman. And then 2 days later, he offered ice cream to 6-year-old Gilbert Martinez, who was, of course, dumb enough to take it. 2 years later, a man out walking his dog literally found Hatcher beating and sodomizing this 6-year-old boy. He called police, came out, quickly arrested Hatcher, who was under the name Albert Ralph Price. Now, at this time, while he is being held for the rape and kidnapping of this child, he began to claim that he heard voices in his head and actually attempted suicide on multiple attempts to avoid getting sentenced to prison again. For the next 2 years, he met with doctors and psychiatrists, all of whom clearly stated that he was mentally ill and he needed treatment. And so he went to California State Hospital, but then he escaped that hospital on June 2nd, 1971. A week after he escaped, he was arrested for stealing a car. And although he identified himself as Richard Lee Grady, police were not fooled by this. They knew who he was. And so they threw him back into California State Hospital for more treatment. Meanwhile, prosecutors, they're still trying to figure out what to do with the Gilbert Martinez case. By now, this case had been dragging on for 2 years while Hatcher was being transferred between hospitals and various prisons. Several professionals who examined Charles Hatcher deemed him as a danger to other patients, a mentally disordered sex offender, and a manipulative, institutionalized sociopath. That I don't know how you get these sorts of assessments and not just immediately lock this person away forever, but it's California. However, finally, in April of 1973, Hatcher was sentenced to 1 year to life in prison, which I don't know how more vague of a prison sentence you can get, right? California, again, clearly demonstrating they have no idea what they're doing or how the justice system should work, because they're going to sentence this guy, a habitual offender in Missouri, clear murderer, kidnapper, child molester, and they're going to sentence him to 1 year to life in prison. Why? I don't understand that. And maybe there's like some sort of legalese language in there that explains that clearly. But if I'm seeing 1 year to life in prison, I'm taking that literally as that we're just going to throw him in there. Whatever happens, happens. And here's the even crazier part. 3 years into his sentence, the California Parole Board ruled that Hatcher had improved dramatically and granted him a modified parole in 1977, at which point Hatcher happily walked out of prison and into a halfway house in San Francisco. And remember, he has been assessed as a manipulative, institutionalized sociopath. So of course, he has the ability to trick people into thinking that he's totally rehabilitated and totally fine and not a danger to society anymore. Well, in 1978, Hatcher had left California and moved to Nebraska, which I don't know how he was allowed to do that as part of his parole. He then returned to his old ways by assaulting a 16-year-old boy. He was quickly arrested under the name Richard Clark because he hadn't learned that simply changing his name was not enough to hide his actual identity. He spent a couple of months in another mental hospital before being sent back out into the world again. Because Nebraska's not going to care about anything. In 1979, he was sent to another mental health facility after attempting to murder a 7-year-old boy. He was then released again the following year, but was thrown back in jail 2 months later after he assaulted another kid. This is like, oh God, I feel like, his history tries to paint people like Hatcher as the bad guy in this, but he's just the chaos in this story. The real bad guys are these state governments who continuously fail to do their jobs properly with zero common sense, no common sense whatsoever. Like Nebraska, being Nebraska, should have executed this guy on the spot. And then they're just like, oh God, we don't want to deal with it. We're from Nebraska. We are full of people who gave up in life. We are also going to give up. We're just going to let him go. And so he escaped from jail in September of 1980, but was then thrown into another facility in Lincoln, Nebraska a month later after another attempted assault and sodomization of a 17-year-old. Now, I am sure, like you, at this point, everyone's ready to send this guy to death row. And honestly, we were probably all ready for this 3, 5, 7 minutes ago. And sure, you can make the argument with John, he has a mental illness, he can't help it. Well, then you got to help him. The government got to step in. Somebody got to step in and lock him away. And that sounds mean, but literally put him in a facility that he can't escape from and give him treatment and don't fall for his manipulative sociopathic bullcrap either. Like, he's just a terrible person, whether he can help it or not. And look, here's the thing, right? Natural selection, the weakest links are going to get taken out. And one of the problems that I have with the libs is they want to protect the weakest link a lot of the time. And that's holding society back a lot of times, I think. And, it's like, I get, like, a lot of people have mental disorders and things that they cannot control. And there are treatments for that. And there are things that you can do to help people become better adjusted and to become contributing members of society. Charles Ray Hatcher was not that. And I'm probably preaching to the choir. I can't imagine anyone is listening to this and being like, I disagree. He should have been, we should have done more to help him. No, at this point, kill him. Like, somebody, even if it's just vigilante street justice, somebody just take him out, right? Here's the thing. Either people in Nebraska felt too sorry for him or they didn't care. I don't think they cared, right? Like, people in the Midwest, very just apathetic toward these things. In Nebraska especially, because that's just full of people who gave up trying to make it out to California. They got to Nebraska and were just like, whatever. And so, where are we at? Hatcher spends 3 weeks in this mental health facility in Lincoln before he was moved to a Salvation Army shelter in Davenport, Iowa. On July 30th, 1982, guess what, guys? The body of 11-year-old Michelle Steele was found naked and mutilated on the banks of the Missouri River near St. Joseph, Missouri. And the next day, Hatcher, who had kind of come to understand this pattern of behavior better than any police officer or investigator ever could, tried to just check himself into the St. Joseph State Hospital. He just walks in. He's like, hey, guys, I killed somebody else again. I need more treatment. It's not working. Well, instead, he was arrested for Steele's murder. And he also then decided at that point to confess to 15 other murders that he had committed along the way. And somehow, despite all of the evidence against him, plus Hatcher's own request to get the death penalty, a Missouri jury sentenced him to life in prison on December 3rd, 1984. And then 4 days later, thankfully, the one right thing this guy ever did, he hanged himself in his prison cell. And God, like, he should have done that, honestly, a decade before, if not, more than that. But it ended up working out, so it's fine. Our next story here, I just got so angry about his story. Our next story here is of Herbert Mullin, who was born on April 18th, 1947 and grew up in Santa Cruz, California. Oh, look, another California. Guess what? Richard Chase is California too. Mullin had a wonderful childhood with a supportive family, and he was actually even voted most likely to succeed by his high school classmates. However, shortly after graduating high school, his best friend died in a car accident, and that was the key canon event that just warped his brain and sent him down the absolute wrong path. He started by building a shrine to his dead friend in his bedroom, and then he started getting paranoid that he was gay, even though he had been in a relationship with a woman for a few years. But look, he probably was gay. Like, that's not just like a thing that you get paranoid about. That's not true. It's either you probably know, right? But again, it's the 60s. Things are more accepting now, but still a lot of families there, older parents, they don't get it, man. And they probably aren't as accepting of it. And so he doesn't want to bring shame to his family. And so he's trying to figure it all out. In 1969, Mullin actually let his family check him into a mental institution, and he bounced around various hospitals over the next several months, trying to get a diagnosis, trying to get treatment, but things just kept getting worse. He started extinguishing his cigarettes on his skin because I guess he liked, feeling the pain of the burn or whatever. He tried to become a priest, and then he just started shouting at the floor to non-existent people that he thought were below him, or like on a floor beneath him or on the ground underneath him, whatever. By 1972, Mullin was back living with his parents, where he started hearing voices telling him that a massive earthquake was coming and the only way to save California was to make a human sacrifice. Now, it didn't help that Mullin's birthday was the anniversary date of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that killed as many as 3,000 people and destroyed over 80% of the city. Mullin also then came to believe that the Vietnam War had actually provided enough American deaths to appease the earthquake gremlin and prevent another earthquake from happening. But since the war was coming to an end, he needed to take matters into his own hands and make sure that there were enough human deaths to make sure that the earthquake didn't happen. This all makes perfect sense. I totally get it. On October 13th, 1972, Mullin beat a homeless man to death with a baseball bat. However, the problem there was that Mullin thought that this homeless man was Jonah, from the Bible, who got eaten by the whale. Even more, he believed that Jonah had telepathically told him, quote, "Pick me up and throw me over the boat, kill me so that others will be saved." So he's way gone. Like, he is just in an alternate reality of crazy right now. And apparently, like, again, it's a homeless guy. Police aren't really concerned about a disappearance of a homeless guy. They disappear and come back all the time. Well, after 11 days later, Mullin picked up a hitchhiker, stabbed her through her chest, dissected her body, and then tossed the pieces along a rural road. And then a week after that, Mullin went to St. Mary's Church in Los Gatos to confess to this murder. And as he spoke to the priest, as he's confessing this, he came to the realization, mostly thanks to the voices in his head, that the priest had just kindly volunteered to be Mullin's next sacrifice, which absolutely was not the case. The priest did not say that. And so inside the confession box, I guess, Mullin proceeded to, well, I guess he didn't do it in the confession. He probably just came back out, opened the other side of the confession box, and started beating and stabbing this priest to death. After murdering that priest, Mullin decided to try to join the Marines, but thanks to his prior arrest record and his clear history of mental illness, he was denied acceptance. Instead of accepting that rejection based on a growing list of hard evidence and common sense, Mullin believed that a powerful group of hippies were conspiring against him and holding him back from living a successful life. I'm not making any of this up. These are what he actually thought. This is what he actually thought. So now he's, I guess, saved the world from the earthquake, or at least, that's kind of like his main quest. Now he's on this side quest to take out this cabal of hippies conspiring against him to achieve success in life. So the next year, Mullin, he decides to try to turn things around, and he stops using drugs, which he believed, and probably rightfully so, that that's what was causing all of his problems. Just some real shady weed and probably some acid just melting his brain into just all kinds of crazy. And look, here's the thing. I am a big proponent of drugs. And let me explain. I think that natural drugs, things that are natural, that have been deemed terrible by the government, natural plant-based drugs have a lot of healing properties that are safer than lab-created pharmaceuticals. And so, things like marijuana, naturally occurring marijuana, I think is good for people in a lot of instances. But at the same time, some people just can't handle it. Like your brain chemistry or just your body composition, whatever it is, just does not respond very well to it. Just like some people's bodies don't respond well to Taco Bell. Perfectly reasonable. You shouldn't do Taco Bell a lot in life, as good as it is. Just like if your brain doesn't respond well to drugs, don't do drugs. It's pretty clear, right? Like there's no universal solution for everybody. So you should just, understand like, hey, I just can't enjoy that thing like other people can. And you move on and you have to accept that. It sucks, but you move on and accept that. After quitting drugs and vowing to be sober, he then went out and bought several guns and planned to kill Jim Gianera, who was an old high school friend of his who had actually gotten him into marijuana to begin with. It's all Jim's fault. Jim's part of this hippie cabal. He started it. He was the plant who gave him the marijuana that sent Mullin down this path, and now Jim has to die. So when Mullin arrived, here's what's crazy about this. Like Mullin's been out of high school for several years. But he goes to Gianera's old high school home, and he was shocked. Could not believe that Gianera and his family had moved away. like people don't move a lot. The house's current resident, Kathy Francis, gave Mullin the Gianera's new address, where he then actually went and killed Gianera and his wife. Mullin then returned to the original address and killed Kathy Francis and her two sons just because, I guess. A month later, he then killed 4 teenage boys that he found camping in a state park. And here's what's crazy. He's just on this murder spree. Where's the police in all of this? Nowhere to be found. Like, and I get it. It's the early 70s. There's serial killing going on all over California at this point. But is there just like, there's no way Herbert Mullin was so good at murder that he didn't leave very obvious signs that he was committing all these. I refuse to believe that. But he's going around killing all these people all willy-nilly, and no one cares. No one cares to go and like try to find him. So on February 17th, 1973, Mullin was driving down a suburban Santa Cruz street when he saw Fred Perez weeding his lawn. And for whatever reason, Mullin stopped, turned around, and drove back to Perez's house. And in broad daylight, in front of God and everybody, got out of his car with his rifle, laid it across his hood, and shot Perez. Broad daylight. Like, tons of people saw this happen. And at that point, finally, Mullin was arrested a few minutes later. He openly confessed to all of his murders and took credit for saving California from the massive earthquake. Despite pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, Mullin was convicted of every murder charge and sentenced to life in prison. And while there, he actually was either in an adjacent cell to or briefly shared a cell with Edmund Kemper, who we covered way back in episode number 34, if you want to go check out that story. Kemper was, as kind of a recap, Kemper was actually super, super smart, but he also really hated his mom. And, he decapitated his mom, put her hand on a stick, put his wiener in her dead skull, all that kind of crazy stuff. Kemper, though, did a lot of interviews and talked about his time with Mullin, saying that, like, he was really annoyed. He hated Herbert Mullin because Mullin had a habit of, like, singing and bothering people when they were trying to just watch TV. So Kemper actually started throwing water on Mullin to shut him up. And he would then, like when Mullin would behave, Kemper would give him peanuts. And ultimately, Kemper like psychologically changed Mullin's behavior to where Mullin would actually ask Kemper permission to sing. It was crazy. But he was denied parole 8 times, and he did end up dying on August 18th, 2022, at age 75 from just natural causes. All right, our final story here is of Richard Chase, who was born on May 23rd, 1950, to a pair of abusive parents. As a child, he began showing signs of the McDonald triad, which a lot of modern psychologists kind of debunked this as like a legitimate theory today. But back then, when there was a lot of serial killer activity going, people were trying to understand it. And honestly, you can see a lot of these patterns in a lot of the stories that we've covered. But the McDonald triad was a theory proposed by psychiatrist J.M. McDonald in 1963 that basically tried to indicate whether or not someone would be prone to violent behavior later in life. And the three signs of the triad are arson, animal cruelty, and chronic bedwetting, which, like, if the amount of times we've covered a serial killer who did not exhibit at least one of those behaviors during childhood has been rare. Like the vast majority have had at least one of those traits. However, modern psychologists think that that's really just more coincidental. It's really more endemic of like brain damage or some sort of developmental disability rather than, that's really more of an effect rather than a cause, right? As Richard got older, though, he became a hypochondriac, like a crazy specific hypochondriac. He would hold oranges on his head because he believed that the vitamin C would be absorbed into his brain through diffusion, which was somehow more effective than just actually eating the orange. He became very paranoid and believed that his heart randomly would just stop beating at times because someone had broken in one night and stolen his pulmonary artery, even though he had no scars or anything. He had no idea how someone did it, but he was wholly convinced that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery, which would cause his heart to just stop beating at times. He also ended up shaving his head because he believed that his cranial bones had separated and he wanted to just watch his skull move around, which anyway, I shouldn't laugh. When he started thinking that his mother was trying to poison him, which, I mean, who would blame her? Richard decided to move out and got an apartment with a few friends who immediately regretted inviting him in because all he did was just walk around naked while high on weed and LSD, which, again, if you are severely mentally ill, taking regular LSD is not going to make things better for you. That's just gonna really clear up all of the blurry nightmares in your head and make them extremely obvious and real to you. And just, again, don't recommend that. So his friends eventually asked him to move out, but when Richard refused, they all left him in the apartment by himself to cover the rent and everything on his own. Richard soon began capturing, killing, and disemboweling any animal that crossed his path wherever he was. He would then eat the meat raw and then mix other parts in a blender with Coca-Cola because he believed that eating these animals would prevent his heart from shrinking. Because now, not only does his heart just randomly stop beating, but it's getting smaller. And then that that prevents the blood from getting all the way around his body. And he can't, I don't know. I can't follow the logic. Richard was finally admitted to a mental institution in 1976 after he was caught injecting rabbit blood directly into his veins. And that, if there's ever a good breaking point in your life, it's probably when you're injecting rabbit blood into your veins. I don't know how that doesn't kill him or make him extremely sick, but whatever. While he was inside this mental institution, he caught 2 birds through the window, which is crazy impressive for even just a sober person, much less this wacko. And he caught these birds, broke their necks, and drank their blood, which, ew. He then stole syringes from the hospital and then went to the therapy dogs and extracted their blood and drank it. I'm crazy, right? Like, I have crazy thoughts and I do silly things, but that clearly pales in comparison to just free-handing birds who are notoriously not exactly comfortable around people. They give you space and for you to just grab a bird and then rip its head off and drink its blood, like I don't even want to live inside your brain for a day, because I don't know what kind of nightmares are flowing around in there. But God, is it entertaining to read and watch happen. So after undergoing treatment with various psychotropic drugs, Richard was deemed fit to return to society and released to his mother's custody. And why? California, why? Like, it doesn't surprise me that he was deemed fit, but why? There are just things you can't do in life, and stealing syringes and and stealing the blood from therapy dogs and drinking it. That's one of those things that like should guarantee that you're never going back out in public ever again. Like, that's not okay. That's bad behavior and unforgivable, really. Like, did he hurt anybody? No, I don't think those therapy dogs got hurt from that, but still, I don't, you just can't, you can't have people like that out in public after they do something like that. However, because his mother was the best mother ever, just totally, just understanding and an angel, she then weaned him off his medications and got him his own apartment, because that's exactly what he needed. A year later, Richard was stopped by police in Nevada when they found that he was just, standing by his truck with blood stained all over his clothes, just like wet, like not even just dried blood, but he's wet from just like he went swimming in a pool of blood, just all over him. And he also had a bucket full of blood in his truck. Now, police asked him reasonably, like, "Hey, bud, you know, what's going on here?" And Richard told him that it was just cow's blood. And since it wasn't a person, and I guess they just didn't want to deal with that today, they let him go, which in hindsight, they probably shouldn't have done. They should have definitely looked into that more. But on December 29th, 1977, Richard killed 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin in a drive-by shooting. 2 weeks later, he tried to break into a woman's home, but the door was locked. And so Richard took this as a sign that he wasn't welcome, whereas I guess he interpreted unlocked doors as a free invitation to just come in and drop deuces all over the place, because that's exactly what he did to his next victim. Like, it's so, like, he tries to break into this woman's house, all the doors are locked, and it's just like, oh, I guess I'm not welcome here. I'll go to the next house. It's unlocked. They want me here. No, they don't. It's not your house. But then he's just dropping trowel and taking dumps all over the carpet, like a dog who can't hold it in anymore or isn't house trained or something. I don't know. But that he did. He would just break into houses and take poops everywhere. Unreal. On January 23rd, 1978, Richard broke into Teresa Wallen's house. Teresa was 3 months pregnant at the time, but that did not matter to Richard because he stabbed her to death with a butcher knife and then had sex with her corpse. He then removed several of her organs and cut off one of her nipples. And then, just because, I guess, I don't know, before he left, he went out to the backyard, grabbed a piece of dog poop, and went back in and stuffed it down her throat. Like, why? Why? Haven't you done enough to this poor woman already? Oh, God. 4 days later, he then broke into 38-year-old Evelyn Maroth's house. He was unexpectedly greeted by her friend, Danny Meredith, who Richard shot with his .22 pistol. Richard then shot Evelyn, her 6-year-old son, and her 22-month-old nephew. He then had sex with Evelyn's corpse and also ate a few pieces of her body. A concerned neighbor heard the gunshots and knocked on the door, which spooked Richard enough to cause him to run out the back door, steal Danny's car, and then take the body of Evelyn's nephew with him. Police arrived a short time later and thankfully found perfect hand and shoe prints that were in a pool of Evelyn's blood that they were able to then take and get a match for. They arrived at Richard's apartment a few hours later, where they found practically every square inch of this house soaked in blood. Remember that cow blood? Yeah. He's just painting his walls with it. Just just anything he could find. And it's wet. The carpet, the walls, the furniture, it's all covered in blood. And not just like look, here's the thing. When we say covered in blood, a lot of times, like, you know, you got some big stains. Maybe there's a pool here and there, maybe a big splatter on the wall. No, this is like wall to wall, covered in blood. And finally, on May 8th, 1979, Richard was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in the gas chamber. Before his execution, he granted a series of interviews to Robert Ressler, who was an FBI agent who actually later coined the term serial killer, or maybe he had done so already, but spoke to the guy who invented the term serial killer. And during these interviews, Richard talked about the Nazis who were flying around on UFOs and how the Nazis in their UFOs had telepathically convinced him to kill people. He then asked Ressler to give him a radar gun, which he said he was going to use to capture the Nazi UFOs and then force them to stand trial for the murders that he had committed. It's not possible. He then, it's so random. He then, during these interviews, would just pull out wads of macaroni and cheese from his pockets, but not as a snack, because that's the kind of crazy that you would expect. He has these wads of macaroni and cheese in his hands, and he explained to Ressler that he had been hoarding them because he believed that the prison officials had been working with the Nazis to kill him by poisoning his food, and that this mac and cheese was poisoned and that it needed to be tested. Anyway, Richard was found dead in his prison cell on December 26, 1980, after overdosing on his antidepressants. All right, 3 more stories in the books here. Just wild. Mental illness is so wild, and it's unfortunate because, and look, everybody's got a thing, right? Maybe you're anxious, maybe you're depressed, maybe you're a little bipolar. Everybody's probably got a thing, right? But there's this level of mental illness, which is so fascinating, and it's funny. It is objectively funny. Maybe it's a little sad if you have that sort of sympathy for people, but also it's pretty funny. So let's recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, Charles Ray Hatcher, arrested, sent to prison so many times. And then every single time they let him out. And then he even got to the point where he would just admit himself after committing murders before someone finally decided to put him in jail forever, where he then ended up killing himself. Number 2, Herbert Mullin believed that the earthquake gremlins were going to make a giant earthquake that would kill, I guess, all of California. And he had to save the world. And he tried to, and he thinks he did. So I don't know. I mean, look, he probably died thinking he was a hero. So that's probably fine. And then number 3, Richard Chase. Here's the thing. I left out a very important detail in his story. And, you know, look, he thought that the Nazis in the UFOs and were trying to kill him with poison mac and cheese, and that's cool. But remember the part of the story that I told you where he broke into this home, killed the pregnant lady, and then stole the car and carried the corpse of the 22-month-old with him back to his house. Do you want to know what he did with that 22-year-old or 22-month-old back at his house? You don't. You probably go ahead and skip ahead about 30 seconds if you don't want to hear this. But he chopped off the baby's penis and then used it as a straw to suck the blood out of the boy's body. What is going on? Next week on Our Weird World, we've talked a lot about some bad men over the last couple of weeks. So let's switch it up and talk about some more awful women in history. Going to look at the stories of Christine Falling, Juana Barraza, and Catherine Monvoisin, and Lavinia Fisher. 4 stories next week of just some terrible women. Just gonna look, gotta spread it around, gotta spread the love around. Men, white men especially, dominate this podcast. So we're gonna switch it up and talk about some women, and hopefully kind of get a little bit of a palate cleanser as we get closer to episode 200. I think I know what I'm going to do. So excited to see how that goes. Oh boy. All right. That's it. That last detail from Richard Chase really messed with me. Just of all the crazy things that came out of my mouth during this episode, that's gross. And it's the worst thing I may have ever said out loud. So cool. I'm a different person now. You're a different person for having listened to it. So enjoy your week. Thanks for listening. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird. I never stay in one place too long. A dirt road singing me a siren song. I gotta find a field. I need to spin my wheels. I got a hankering for 4 wide tires, and I can't help it. It's the way I'm wired. 'Fore you get too close, boy, you need to know. There ain't no braking when I throw it in drive. Don't always keep it in between the lines. If you're ready for a ride, pedal down, state of mind. Boy, I tell you what, you better buckle up. I got a heart like a truck. It's been drugged through the mud. Runs on dreams and gasoline, and that old highway holds the key. It's got a lead foot down when it's leaving. Lord knows it's taken a hell of a beating. A little bit of love is all that it's needing, but it's good as it is tough. I got a heart like a truck.